Hey friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is continuing our series in our deep dive into the apocalyptic literature, the genre of apocalyptic literature. And this Before You Read lecture will consider a book known as Second Baruch. You might be asking yourself, if there's a second Baruch, what is the first Baruch? Would I know a first Baruch or not? And the answer is yes, maybe. If you grew up in a Catholic tradition, you might know a book known as Baruch. Baruch is a book that is contained in the Apocrypha, that middle literature that the Protestant tradition does not view as canonical, but the Catholic tradition does. And Baruch is a figure. The book of Baruch is written in the name of a figure named Baruch. We know of Baruch from the book of Jeremiah. Baruch was a friend and a secretary to the prophet Jeremiah. And so Baruch, much like Jeremiah, is writing around the time of exile, around the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BCE. But most scholars doubt that this book of Baruch, this first Baruch, if you will, is actually written by that historical persona. Rather, it's more likely that it is written in the name of Baruch, and that in the Jewish imagination, Baruch is associated with the destruction of Jerusalem. Baruch is associated with exile. And just like Jeremiah and Lamentations and other books in the Hebrew Bible that are dealing with this period, Baruch is wondering about God's justice, about God's goodness, about God's love of Israel, and so forth. All of these kinds of questions that are brought up by the destruction of the temple. So then, what is Second Baruch, and why are we focusing on it? Second Baruch is another writing that is attributed to or associated with Baruch, this character that we meet in the book of Jeremiah. But once again, it's very unlikely that Second Baruch is written by Baruch. In fact, it's quite likely that this book is written some 600 years after that time period of the destruction of the first temple and the exile. The work of Second Baruch is a work of varied contents. It is a sort of a composite or a diverse book. It includes lamentations and prayers. It contains a series of questions with answers. It has a number of apocalypses or visions that include various explanations. It contains some direct addresses to the Jewish people as well as a letter to the Jewish people at the end. What we learn in the beginnings of Second Baruch, chapters 1 through 8 or so, is it's set in this period right after the destruction of the first temple and the destruction of Jerusalem in 587. And so the book opens with a sort of description and response to that historical reality. But most, if not all, believe that this is not the case at all. But in fact, Second Baruch is written in the context and in response to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, following the Jewish war with Rome. Second Baruch was most likely written in Hebrew and then translated into Greek. That Greek translation was then translated into Syriac, and our modern translations of Second Baruch, our English translations of Second Baruch, are largely dependent on this Syriac tradition, informed by this Syriac tradition. The writing of Second Baruch is hard to date with any sort of precision, but most scholars suggest that it was written after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, and it was likely written before another another early Christian writing known as the Epistle of Barnabas was written sometime in 120 or 130. And so most scholars would put Second Baruch sometime in the first or second decade of the 2nd century CE. It was most likely written in Palestine and to those that were living still in Palestine. One of the interesting things about Second Baruch is that, like Fourth Ezra, it is motivated and concerned by the destruction of the temple that followed the Jewish war. But it actually has some interesting and conflicting information or details about the temple. Some of the visions don't mention the temple in the sort of restored or ideal world that comes after God's judgment. So there's some ambivalence towards the second temple, towards the institution, we might say, of the temple. Second Baruch contains what I would call is almost a library of theological themes. It includes some reflection on the Anointed One or the Messiah. It depicts God as a creator and God as a judge and God as the one who sort of foreordains things to happen. And yet God's ways are unknowable and mysterious, Second Baruch maintains. The book provides a number of places to reflect on God's choice of Israel, God's love of Israel, and how that love is related to God's apparent abandonment of the people of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. We see in this time that what I would say is connecting with rabbinic Judaism at the same time, which is the importance of the law. So if we've lost the sacrificial element through the temple, what we see happening in the late first and early second centuries is a greater focus on the law, the study of the law, living in obedience to the law, and so forth. And another theological theme that will be important and prominent is the final judgment, the judgment of the dead and the resurrection of the dead. Second Baruch is a long book. It's a long writing. It would take a good bit of time to work through all of it. And so we're going to focus on two sections. One is a much smaller section, and then one is a longer section. So the first section that I'm inviting us to consider is Second Baruch chapters 9 through 12. And this is Baruch's initial lament. It follows on the sort of description of the fallen Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and we get, for the first time, Baruch's response. And again, I think that this provides an emotional and a theological sort of core for understanding the rest of the work of Second Baruch. The second part that we're going to focus on is chapters 21 through 52. That's the larger and longer section. This is an interesting sort of middle in the work of Second Baruch. It gives us a nice combination of some prayers, some question with answers, and some of these revelations that I mentioned earlier. Lots of relevant themes as well in this larger section that we'll focus on. Again, we have reflection on the Anointed One or the Messiah. We have descriptions of the resurrection of the dead. We have final judgment. And we have God as the determining factor of life as we know it. So why did I choose these two sections? One, it's manageable. I think it's a section that you can read and sort of digest in an appropriate amount of time. I think it will give you a feel for the larger work as well as its specific areas of focus. And speaking as a New Testament scholar to a Christian church, it has a lot of interesting connections to the New Testament. Not just the book of Revelation, but also Paul's letters and other parts of the New Testament in early Christianity. As you read, again, as I've done with these previous lectures, just a couple of things for you to be on the lookout for. Maybe some focal points for you to be taking notes. The first is to think through how Second Baruch functions as a response to crisis, specifically the destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple. The second question is, how does Second Baruch understand and deal with the problem of evil or the apparent lack of concern by God? Third, what is God like in this part of Second Baruch? How would you describe him? What are God's key characteristics? And finally, what do we learn from Second Baruch regarding expectations for the Anointed One or the Messiah, for the resurrection of the dead, and for the final judgment? Well, friends, we are nearing the end of our study of apocalyptic literature outside of the Bible. After this, we'll come back to the book of Revelation and focus on some of its chapters and some of its major themes. I hope that this reading from Second Baruch will be interesting and compelling, that it will offer some interesting comparisons with the New Testament, and that we'll have a rich and vibrant discussion of it. For now, happy reading.